The emergency alert pierced through the NATO Communications Hub in Brussels at 0347 hours, its shrill tone cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a blade through silk. Red lights bathed the underground facility in an ominous glow as encrypted. Messages fluttered in from 17 different intelligence agencies across 3 continents. Something catastrophic was happening, but no one could understand what. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the chaos that followed, as senior officers barked orders and analysts scrambled to make sense of fragmented intelligence reports, nobody noticed the quiet woman in the corner methodically examining patterns that everyone else had dismissed as digital noise. Elena Vasquez had learned long ago that the most important truths often whispered where others expected them to shout. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision, isolating frequency signatures that had been buried beneath layers of sophisticated encryption. While chaos erupted around her, Elena saw something that made her blood run cold. Hidden within what appeared to be routine diplomatic traffic was a countdown sequence, embedded so cleverly that traditional decryption protocols couldn't even detect its existence. 26 hours until activation. Whatever was being planned would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Europe, and Elena was the only person who could see it coming. But Major Richard Blackwood had already made it clear that her opinions weren't welcome in his command center. The woman he dismissed as a glorified secretary was about to become the only thing standing between NATO and its darkest hour. Elena Vasquez arrived at the NATO Communications Hub every morning at precisely 0630 hours, her footsteps echoing through corridors that hummed with the constant flow of classified information. At 32, she moved through the underground facility with the measured pace of someone who had learned to become invisible in plain sight. Her dark hair was pulled into a functional ponytail, and her civilian clothes marked her as support staff rather than military personnel, distinction that mattered more than it should in a world where uniforms determined worth. The Brussels facility operated as the nerve center for NATO's intelligence operations, a maze of reinforced concrete tunnels 3 stories beneath the Belgian capital. Diplomatic cables, satellite intercepts, and communications from 47 different allied nations flowed through its secure channels 24 hours a day. Elena's official title was Communications Analysis Specialist, a deliberately vague designation that allowed her to work on translation and basic pattern recognition without drawing attention to capabilities that went far deeper. She maintained a small workstation in Section C, surrounded by junior analysts who processed routine diplomatic traffic and commercial intercepts. Her supervisor, Sergeant David Kim, treated her with professional courtesy, but even he had no idea that the woman cataloging embassy communications had once held the highest security clearances in the American intelligence community. Elena had become a master of strategic invisibility, hiding extraordinary skills behind a facade of clerical competence. The morning routine never varied. Elena would review overnight cable traffic, flag potential items of interest for senior analysts, and maintain the databases that kept NATO's communication systems running smoothly. It was mind-numbing work for someone who had once broken encryption schemes that baffled entire departments, but it offered something more valuable than intellectual stimulation: safety. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. 3 years ago, Elena Vasquez had been Dr. Elena Vasquez, the youngest division chief in NSA history, leading a team of cryptographers who specialized in breaking the most sophisticated enemy communications. Her reputation for solving impossible puzzles had made her indispensable to American intelligence operations. She could look at seemingly random data and find patterns that revealed enemy intentions, decode messages that others couldn't even identify as communications. That expertise had made her powerful enemies. The downfall had come through Colonel Marcus Steele, her former mentor and the man who had recruited her straight from MIT. Steele had been selling classified decryption techniques to foreign intelligence services for over 2 years, using Elena's breakthrough algorithms to line his own pockets while compromising American operations worldwide. When Elena stumbled across evidence of his betrayal, she had tried to work through proper channels, believing that the system would protect someone doing the right thing. Instead, Steele's network of corrupt officials had turned the investigation against her. Falsified evidence suggested that Elena herself was the security breach, that her access to sensitive systems had been compromised by foreign handlers. The case against her was built with surgical precision, using her own reputation for unconventional thinking against her. Who else would have the skills to sell American cryptographic secrets? Who else had access to the specific systems that had been compromised? The security clearance review had been swift and merciless. Elena's access was revoked pending investigation, her team disbanded, her life's work scattered across different departments. The formal charges never materialized. There wasn't enough real evidence for a criminal case, but her career was effectively over. No intelligence agency would hire someone whose loyalty had been questioned at the highest levels. The only person who had believed her innocence was General Patricia Hayes, Elena's former academy instructor who had become a rising star in military intelligence. But Hayes had been deployed to Afghanistan just as the investigation began, leaving Elena to face the machine alone. By the time Hayes returned, the narrative had been set in stone. Elena Vasquez was damaged goods, a security risk who could never again be trusted with sensitive information. So Elena had disappeared. She had legally changed her surname from Rodriguez to Vasquez, moved to Europe, and accepted a position that required only basic security clearance. The NATO Communications Hub needed people with language skills and analytical training, but not the kind of deep access that had made her dangerous to Steele's operation. She could process routine communications without ever seeing the truly sensitive intelligence that flowed through other channels. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who had once protected American national security now sorted through embassy, dinner invitations, and trade delegation schedules. Her workspace was located in the facility's least secure section, surrounded by translators and administrative personnel who handled information that posed no threat to anyone. Elena's colleagues knew her as a competent but unremarkable analyst who showed up on time, completed her assignments without complaint, and kept to herself during breaks. She had cultivated an image of professional adequacy skilled enough to avoid scrutiny, but not so capable that anyone would wonder why she was working below her apparent potential. It was a careful balance that had protected her for 3 years. The only hint of her former life was a small photograph tucked into her desk drawer, showing a younger woman in Air Force dress uniform receiving a commendation from the Secretary of Defense. Elena rarely looked at it anymore, but keeping it served as a reminder that she had once mattered, that her skills had once protected people who would never know her name. Her morning routine included reviewing overnight communications from American diplomatic posts across Europe. Most of it was routine: visa applications, trade discussions, cultural exchange programs. Elena would scan for anything that might require additional analysis, flag potential security concerns, and forward relevant items to appropriate departments. It was work that a recent college graduate could handle, but Elena found small satisfactions in catching details that others missed. The NATO facility operated on a strict hierarchy that reflected both military traditions and international diplomatic protocols. Senior military officers from various allied nations held command positions, while civilian analysts and support staff formed the foundation that kept operations running. Elena existed in the space between these worlds, educated enough to understand complex issues but lacking the credentials that would grant her access to truly important decisions. Major Richard Blackwood embodied everything Elena had learned to avoid in military intelligence. Harvard-educated and politically connected, he had arrived at NATO headquarters 6 months ago with a reputation for ambitious networking and innovative thinking. His family's influence had secured him choice assignments throughout his career, and his confidence in his own abilities was matched only by his dismissive attitude toward anyone he considered intellectually inferior. Blackwood commanded the Threat Analysis Division, responsible for identifying potential security risks to NATO operations. His team of senior analysts held advanced degrees from prestigious universities and security clearances that granted access to the most sensitive intelligence available to the Alliance. They worked in a secure section of the facility that Elena had never seen, processing information that could influence international policy and military strategy. From her position in the communications section, Elena could observe Blackwood's interactions with subordinates and colleagues. He treated senior officers with careful deference while showing barely concealed contempt for anyone below his rank. Support staff were essentially invisible to him, present only to serve his needs and implement his decisions. Elena had watched him reduce junior analysts to tears with cutting comments about their competence, always delivered with a smile that made the cruelty seem almost casual. The first direct encounter had come 2 months ago when Elena was asked to provide translation support for a series of intercepted communications from Eastern Europe. The messages were in a regional dialect that few NATO personnel could read fluently, but Elena's linguistics background made her one of the facility's most capable translators. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had been called to a briefing room where Blackwood was presenting analysis to a group of senior officers. Elena had entered quietly, taking a seat in the back where support personnel typically waited to be called upon. Blackwood was discussing intelligence reports that suggested unusual military activity near several NATO borders, but his analysis struck Elena as fundamentally flawed. He was interpreting routine logistics movements as signs of aggressive intent, missing cultural context. That completely changed the meaning of intercepted communications. When Blackwood paused to ask for translation of a specific message, Elena had provided not just a literal translation, but context that revealed the communication as coordination for a humanitarian relief operation, not military preparation. The correction had been delivered respectfully, but it undermined Blackwood's entire presentation. The room had fallen silent as Blackwood stared at Elena with barely controlled anger. His analysis had been embarrassingly wrong, and a civilian translator had exposed the error in front of his superiors. Rather than acknowledge the mistake, Blackwood had dismissed Elena's input as misinterpretation by someone lacking proper intelligence. "Training. Miss Vasquez," he had said, his voice carrying the condescending tone of someone addressing a child. "I appreciate your linguistic skills, but intelligence analysis requires understanding broader strategic context. Perhaps we should stick to literal translation and leave interpretation to trained professionals." Elena had simply nodded and provided the requested translations without further comment, but the damage was done. Blackwood had been humiliated by someone he considered far beneath his station, and such men rarely forgot such moments. Since then, Blackwood had made a point of dismissing any contribution Elena might make to analytical discussions. When her translations revealed information that contradicted his assessments, he would question her competence or suggest that support staff lacked the training to understand complex intelligence matters. He had begun referring to her as the translator in conversations with other officers, reducing her identity to a single function that emphasized her subordinate status. Dr. Rachel Thompson, a senior analyst who had worked with Elena on several translation projects, had begun to suspect that there was more to Elena's background than her official position suggested. Thompson held a PhD in international relations from Oxford and had spent 15 years analyzing intelligence for various NATO operations. Her trained eye could recognize expertise even when it was deliberately hidden. You have an unusual grasp of intelligence methodology for someone with a translation background, Thompson had observed during a recent project. Your pattern recognition skills are quite sophisticated. Elena had deflected the comment with practiced ease. Languages are all about patterns. Once you understand how communication works in one context, it's easier to see connections in others. But Thompson wasn't satisfied with the explanation. She had noticed that Elena's translations often included insights that went beyond linguistic knowledge, revealing understanding of intelligence techniques and analytical methods that suggested formal training. Thompson had begun quietly investigating Elena's background, using her own security clearance to access personnel files that might reveal more about the mysterious translator. What Thompson discovered was a carefully constructed facade. Elena's official file showed solid credentials in linguistics and European studies, with work experience that justified her current position. But there were gaps in the timeline that didn't quite make sense, references to previous employment that seemed deliberately vague. Thompson's instincts told her that Elena Vasquez was hiding something significant. The dynamic between Elena and Blackwood had grown increasingly tense as the Major's frustration with her competence became more apparent. He had begun excluding her from briefings where her expertise might be needed, preferring to work with translators who wouldn't challenge his analytical assumptions. When forced to include Elena in meetings, he would make pointed comments about knowing one's place and staying within one's area of competence. Elena endured these slights with the patience of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required accepting injustice. She had faced far worse than professional humiliation, and Blackwood's petty cruelties were nothing compared to watching her life's work destroyed by people she had trusted. But each dismissive comment and condescending remark added weight to a burden she had been carrying for 3 years. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a young intelligence officer newly assigned to NATO headquarters, had begun to notice the pattern of disrespect directed toward Elena. Webb had arrived from the Pentagon with idealistic notions about military professionalism and merit-based advancement. Watching Blackwood's treatment of competent personnel challenged those assumptions in uncomfortable ways. "It doesn't seem right," Webb had confided to Sergeant Kim during a coffee break. "Elena clearly knows more about this stuff than half the people in the building, but Blackwood treats her like she's an inconvenience." Kim, who had supervised Elena for 2 years, chose his words carefully. "The Major has strong opinions about chain of command and proper roles. Elena does her job well, and that's what matters." But Webb's comment reflected a growing awareness among junior personnel that something was wrong with the facility's command climate. Blackwood's dismissive attitude toward support staff had created an environment where competence was less important than rank, where valuable insights might be ignored because they came from the wrong source. Elena maintained her daily routine with mechanical precision, processing communications and maintaining databases while carefully avoiding any action that might draw unwanted attention. But beneath the surface of professional competence, she was conducting her own analysis of patterns that others had missed. The intelligence flowing through NATO's communication systems told a story that worried her. There were subtle indicators of coordinated activity across multiple regions, fragments of intercepted communications that suggested something significant was being planned. Elena couldn't access the classified intelligence that would provide complete context, but her training allowed her to recognize dangerous patterns even in routine diplomatic traffic. The problem was that no one would listen to someone whose official job was translating embassy dinner invitations. Elena had learned to live with the frustration of seeing threats that she couldn't report, of understanding dangers that others dismissed as coincidence. Her expertise had become a burden rather than a gift, knowledge that she carried alone because revealing it would expose everything she had worked to hide. As autumn settled over Brussels, bringing cold rain and shortened days, Elena continued her careful balancing act between competence and invisibility. She translated documents, analyzed patterns, and maintained her reputation as a reliable but unremarkable member of the communications staff. The photograph in her desk drawer remained hidden, a reminder of who she had once been and could never be again. But patterns had their own logic, and the intelligence flowing through NATO's systems was beginning to reveal something that would test Elena's commitment to staying hidden. The careful balance she had maintained for 3 years was about to be shattered by events that would force her to choose between safety and the knowledge that lives hung in the balance. Major Blackwood's arrogance had created blind spots in NATO's intelligence analysis, gaps in understanding that were about to become catastrophically dangerous. Elena could see what others missed, but speaking up would mean exposing everything she had worked to protect. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just Elena's future, but the security of the entire Western Alliance. In the shadows of the NATO Communications Hub, the woman dismissed as a translator was about to discover that some truths were too important to remain hidden, regardless of the personal cost. The countdown had already begun, though no one else knew it yet. Elena Vasquez was about to face the choice between preserving her carefully constructed new life and preventing a catastrophe that could reshape the entire geopolitical landscape. The ghost in the communications section was about to step back into the light, whether she wanted to or not. Major Richard Blackwood surveyed his domain from the glass-walled conference room that served as the nerve center for NATO's threat analysis division. The morning briefing had concluded with his characteristic blend of intellectual superiority and casual dismissal of anyone whose credentials didn't match his own. Through the reinforced windows, he could observe the controlled chaos of the communications hub, where dozens of analysts processed intelligence from across the globe. At 38, Blackwood had cultivated an image of effortless competence that masked the political maneuvering behind every assignment he'd received. His corner office displayed diplomas from Harvard and Georgetown alongside photographs of him shaking hands with senators and defense secretaries. The wall behind his desk featured a map of Europe marked with colored pins representing various threat assessments, each one a testament to his analytical prowess. His rise through the ranks had been meteoric by any standard. Fresh out of graduate school, he'd been fast-tracked through intelligence training programs that typically took years to complete. Family connections had opened doors that remained closed to more qualified candidates, while his ability to articulate complex concepts in simple terms had impressed senior officers who valued clarity over depth. The assignment to NATO headquarters represented the culmination of careful career planning. Brussels offered proximity to European power centers, exposure to international intelligence operations, and the kind of high-visibility position that could launch a future run for political office. Blackwood saw his current role as a stepping stone to greater things, a platform for demonstrating the leadership qualities that would eventually carry him to positions of real influence. His command style reflected the confidence of someone who had never faced serious consequences for his decisions. The Threat Analysis Division operated under his direct supervision, with senior analysts reporting their findings through carefully structured briefings that reinforced the hierarchy he'd established. Blackwood demanded absolute clarity in all communications, preferring simple conclusions to nuanced analysis that might complicate decision-making processes. The division's morning routine began at 0800 hours, with a comprehensive review of overnight intelligence reports. Senior analysts would present their assessments of potential threats to NATO operations, regional stability concerns, and emerging security challenges that might require alliance response. Blackwood would guide these discussions with pointed questions designed to test analytical rigor. While demonstrating his own mastery of complex international dynamics, Dr. James Morrison, the division's deputy chief, had worked with Blackwood for 6 months and had learned to navigate his superior's expectations with diplomatic skill. Morrison held a doctorate in international security studies and possessed 20 years of experience analyzing European security issues. His knowledge of regional dynamics was encyclopedic, but he had learned to present his insights in ways that didn't challenge Blackwood's authority or expertise. The Eastern European situation remained stable, Morrison reported during the morning briefing, his presentation slides displaying carefully selected intelligence highlights. Our monitoring stations have detected routine military exercises, but nothing that suggests aggressive intent toward NATO territories. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying the intelligence summaries with the expression of someone evaluating subordinate performance. His questions were designed to demonstrate comprehensive understanding while reinforcing his position as the ultimate authority on threat assessment methodology. What about the communications intercepts from the border regions? Blackwood inquired, his tone suggesting that he already knew the answers but wanted to test Morrison's thoroughness. Have we identified any patterns that might indicate coordination beyond normal exercise parameters? Morrison consulted his notes before responding, aware that Blackwood valued precision in all briefings. The intercepts show standard logistics. Coordination, sir. Radio traffic is consistent with supply chain management for extended training operations. Our linguistic analysis indicates routine military communications without coded elements. The mention of linguistic analysis reminded Blackwood of his ongoing frustration with the communications section's personnel assignments. The facilities' translation capabilities were adequate for routine diplomatic traffic, but the quality of analytical support had become increasingly problematic. Too many translators seemed to think their linguistic skills qualified them to offer strategic insights that went far beyond their areas of expertise. Elena Vasquez represented everything that annoyed Blackwood about the NATO facility's administrative structure. Her official position as communications analysis specialist should have limited her involvement to basic translation and data processing. But she had repeatedly demonstrated the kind of intellectual presumption that undermined proper chain of command protocols. The incident 2 months ago still rankled him when her correction of his threat assessment had embarrassed him in front of senior officers. The problem wasn't her linguistic competence, which was admittedly superior to most NATO translators. The issue was her apparent belief that translation work qualified her to question analytical conclusions reached by trained intelligence professionals. Blackwood had encountered similar problems throughout his career. Support personnel who confused technical competence with strategic understanding, civilians who failed to appreciate the complexities of military intelligence operations. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Bennett, the facility's operations coordinator, had raised concerns about communication between different sections of the intelligence hub. Bennett was a career officer whose diplomatic skills had made her valuable in coordinating between NATO's various national contingents, but she sometimes displayed troubling sympathy for personnel who failed to understand their proper roles. Major, we've had some feedback from the communications section about analytical support requests, Bennett mentioned during the briefing's conclusion. There seems to be some confusion about protocols for interdisciplinary consultation. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly as he considered the implications of Bennett's diplomatic language. What kind of confusion, Colonel? Bennett chose her words carefully, aware that Blackwood was sensitive about challenges to his authority. Some of the translation staff have been asking questions about broader context for their assignments. They seem to want more background information than their security clearances allow. The comment confirmed Blackwood's suspicions about the communications section's personnel problems. Support staff were apparently dissatisfied with their assigned roles, seeking access to information that was properly restricted to trained analysts. This kind of intellectual curiosity might seem admirable in academic settings, but it represented a serious security concern in military intelligence operations. The clearance system exists for good reasons, Blackwood responded firmly. Personnel are granted access to information commensurate with their training and responsibilities. Translation staff should focus on linguistic accuracy rather than attempting strategic analysis. Dr. Morrison nodded agreement, though privately he wondered if the facility might be underutilizing some of its personnel. During his occasional interactions with communications section staff, he had been impressed by their analytical sophistication. Elena Vasquez in particular seemed to possess unusual insight into intelligence methodology, raising questions about whether her current assignment fully utilized her capabilities. But Morrison had learned not to challenge Blackwood's personnel assessments directly. The Major's confidence in his own judgment was absolute, and he interpreted questions about his decisions as challenges to his authority. Morrison had watched other senior analysts transfer to different assignments after expressing views that conflicted with Blackwood's established positions. The morning briefing concluded with Blackwood's standard reminder about maintaining appropriate boundaries between different sections of the intelligence facility. The Threat Analysis Division operated at the highest levels of classification, processing information that could influence NATO military strategy and international diplomatic relations. This responsibility required absolute discretion and adherence to security protocols that prevented unauthorized personnel from accessing sensitive intelligence. Blackwood's afternoon schedule included a presentation to visiting officials from the Pentagon, an opportunity to demonstrate NATO's analytical capabilities while showcasing his own expertise in European security issues. The presentation would cover recent threat assessments and emerging challenges to alliance stability, topics that allowed him to display comprehensive understanding of complex international dynamics. Preparation for high-level briefings represented one of Blackwood's greatest strengths. His ability to synthesize complex information into clear, actionable intelligence had impressed senior officers throughout his career. He could take fragmented reports from multiple sources and create coherent narratives that explained regional developments and their implications for NATO operations. The challenge was ensuring that all supporting materials met his exacting standards for accuracy and analytical rigor. Translation work, in particular, required careful supervision to prevent misinterpretation of foreign communications that might influence strategic assessments. Blackwood had learned to review all linguistic analysis personally, correcting errors and providing context that less experienced personnel might miss. Elena Vasquez's name appeared on the assignment roster for translation support, a designation that immediately concerned Blackwood. Her previous interactions had demonstrated a troubling tendency to exceed her assigned responsibilities, offering analytical insights that went beyond simple linguistic conversion. The upcoming briefing was too important to risk disruption from support personnel who failed to understand appropriate boundaries. Blackwood called Sergeant David Kim to request alternative translation support for the Pentagon presentation. Kim supervised the communications section's day-to-day operations and was generally responsive to requests from senior officers, but his reaction to this particular request suggested some resistance to Blackwood's personnel preferences. "Sir, Elena Vasquez has the most experience with the specific regional dialects in these communications," Kim explained diplomatically. Her familiarity with cultural context might be valuable for ensuring accurate interpretation. The response irritated Blackwood, who interpreted Kim's advocacy as another example of the communications section's failure to maintain appropriate deference to analytical authority. "Sergeant, I need translation support that focuses on linguistic accuracy rather than analytical interpretation. Perhaps someone with less experience might be more appropriate for this assignment." Kim's hesitation was brief but noticeable, suggesting Disagreement with Blackwood's assessment of personnel capabilities. I understand your preference, sir. I'll arrange alternative support for the briefing. The conversation reinforced Blackwood's conviction that the communications section needed stronger leadership and clearer guidelines about appropriate roles for support personnel. Too many staff members seemed to believe that their technical competence qualified them to participate in analytical discussions that required specialized training and security clearances. Dr. Rachel Thompson had been observing the growing tension between Blackwood and various communications personnel with increasing concern. As a senior analyst with 15 years of NATO experience, Thompson had learned to recognize competence regardless of official titles or security classifications. Her interactions with Elena Vasquez had revealed analytical sophistication that seemed inconsistent with a basic translation assignment. Thompson's own background in intelligence methodology allowed her to appreciate subtle indicators of advanced training. Elena's approach to pattern recognition, her understanding of cryptographic principles, and her grasp of international communications protocols all suggested education and experience that went far beyond linguistic studies. Thompson had begun to suspect that Elena's official personnel file might not reflect her actual qualifications. The investigation had required careful discretion, using Thompson's security clearance to access personnel databases without attracting attention from facility security officers. What she discovered was a carefully constructed professional history that answered basic questions while avoiding deeper scrutiny. Elena's credentials were solid but unremarkable, her work history consistent but strangely generic. More troubling, with a gaps in timeline that suggested periods of employment that weren't reflected in official records. Thompson's experience with intelligence personnel files allowed her to recognize the patterns typical of classified assignments or sensitive positions that couldn't be disclosed in standard documentation. Elena Vasquez appeared to be hiding something significant about her professional background. Thompson had considered approaching Elena directly with her suspicions, but such conversations carried risks for both parties. If Elena was indeed hiding sensitive background information, direct questions might force her to take defensive measures that could complicate her current position. Thompson decided to continue her investigation through official channels while avoiding any action that might alert facility security to her concerns. Lieutenant Marcus Webb had become increasingly frustrated with the command climate that Blackwood had established in the Threat Analysis Division. Webb's idealistic notions about military professionalism were challenged daily by examples of competent personnel being dismissed or marginalized because they lacked proper credentials or failed to demonstrate sufficient deference to established authority. The treatment of Elena Vasquez was particularly troubling to Webb, who had observed her analytical contributions during joint briefings between different facility sections. Her insights consistently demonstrated sophisticated understanding of intelligence methodology. Yet Blackwood routinely dismissed her input as exceeding appropriate boundaries for support personnel. Webb had attempted to discuss his concerns with other junior officers, but most were reluctant to challenge Blackwood's leadership style directly. The Major's political connections and reputation for advancing the careers of loyal subordinates made criticism potentially dangerous for officers seeking promotion or choice assignments. The facility's informal communication networks carried constant speculation about personnel conflicts and command decisions that seemed to prioritize political considerations over operational effectiveness. Webb had heard rumors about talented analysts requesting transfers to escape Blackwood's management style, though such information was carefully concealed from official channels that might reflect poorly on divisional leadership. Captain Diana Foster, the facility's liaison officer for interagency coordination, had worked with Blackwood on several joint intelligence projects and had developed serious reservations about his analytical methodology. Foster's experience with multiple intelligence organizations had taught her to recognize the difference between genuine expertise and confident presentation of superficial knowledge. Blackwood's analytical assessments were consistently well presented and politically astute, but they often missed subtle indicators that more experienced analysts would have recognized immediately. His confidence in his own conclusions was impressive, but it sometimes prevented him from considering alternative interpretations that might challenge his established positions. Foster had noticed that Blackwood's most successful analytical products typically incorporated insights from support personnel whose contributions weren't officially acknowledged. Translation staff and database analysts would provide crucial context or pattern recognition that informed final assessments, but their names rarely appeared in briefing materials or analytical summaries. The upcoming Pentagon presentation represented an opportunity for Blackwood to demonstrate his analytical capabilities to senior American officials who could influence his future career prospects. Foster understood the political importance of successful high-level briefings, but she was concerned about potential gaps in analytical rigor that might emerge under serious scrutiny from experienced intelligence professionals. Elena Vasquez continued her daily routine with mechanical precision, translating diplomatic communications and maintaining databases, while carefully avoiding any action that might attract unwanted attention from Blackwood or his supporters. But her training in pattern recognition made it impossible to ignore subtle indicators that suggested coordinated activity across multiple intelligence channels. The fragments of information available through routine communications processing weren't sufficient to develop comprehensive threat assessments, but they revealed concerning patterns that seemed to be escaping official analytical attention. Elena's experience with cryptographic analysis allowed her to recognize potential code structures in communications that appeared routine to less trained observers. More troubling were the timing correlations between apparently unrelated diplomatic activities across different European regions. Elena could see coordination patterns that suggested careful planning and systematic implementation of some larger strategy, but her official position prevented her from accessing the classified intelligence that would provide complete context. The frustration of seeing potential threats while being unable to report them had become a constant burden for Elena. Her expertise had become a liability rather than an asset, knowledge that isolated her from colleagues who couldn't understand the significance of patterns that seemed obvious to her trained perception. Blackwood's dismissive attitude toward her analytical contributions had created an environment where valuable intelligence might be overlooked because it came from inappropriate sources. Elena understood that speaking up about her concerns would require revealing capabilities that could expose her carefully protected identity, but the alternative might be allowing genuine threats to develop without adequate response. The choice between personal safety and professional responsibility was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. Elena's training told her that significant events were being planned, that the intelligence flowing through NATO systems contained warnings that needed immediate attention from qualified analysts. But the woman dismissed as a translator could not speak without destroying everything she had worked to protect. The tension between Blackwood's authoritarian leadership and the facility's operational requirements was creating dangerous blind spots in NATO's intelligence analysis. Competent personnel were being marginalized while analytical gaps went unrecognized by officers who confused confidence with competence. Elena Vasquez found herself at the center of a gathering storm, possessing crucial insights that could prevent catastrophic intelligence failures while lacking any legitimate channel for sharing her concerns. The careful balance she had maintained for 3 years was about to be tested by events that would force her to choose between continued invisibility and the knowledge that lives might depend on information that only she could provide. Major Blackwood's kingdom of intellectual arrogance was about to face challenges that would expose the fundamental weaknesses in his approach to intelligence analysis. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine whether competence or Credentials would ultimately determine NATO's ability to recognize and respond to emerging threats. The crisis began with what appeared to be a routine communications failure at 14:30 hours on a gray Thursday afternoon in November. The primary satellite link connecting NATO headquarters to monitoring stations across Eastern Europe went dark without warning, cutting off intelligence feeds from 12 critical observation posts along the alliance's most sensitive borders. Within minutes, backup systems began reporting cascading failures that suggested coordinated interference rather than random technical malfunctions. Major Richard Blackwood stood in the Emergency Operations Center watching technicians scramble to restore communications links that represented NATO's early warning capabilities for the entire European theater. Red warning lights bathed the underground facility in an ominous glow as senior officers barked orders and analysts attempted to assess the scope of what appeared to be a sophisticated, cyberattack targeting alliance intelligence infrastructure. Colonel Patricia Hayes had arrived from Washington that morning for what was supposed to be a routine inspection of NATO's intelligence coordination procedures. Instead, she found herself in the middle of the most serious communications crisis the alliance had faced since the end of the Cold War. Hayes carried the kind of security clearances that granted access to intelligence so sensitive that most NATO personnel didn't know it existed, and her presence suggested that American officials were taking this incident very seriously indeed. The timing couldn't have been worse for Blackwood, whose career trajectory depended on demonstrating competent leadership during high-visibility situations. The Pentagon officials he had been scheduled to brief were now witnessing a crisis that challenged his authority and exposed potential weaknesses in the analytical systems he commanded. Hayes was particularly concerning because her reputation for identifying systemic failures in intelligence operations was legendary throughout the American defense establishment. Elena Vasquez received the emergency notification in her communications section workstation, where she had been processing routine diplomatic traffic when the first system alerts began cascading across her monitors. The failure patterns immediately caught her attention because they didn't match the characteristics of typical technical malfunctions or even sophisticated cyberattacks. Something about the sequence suggested deliberate coordination designed to create specific gaps in NATO's intelligence coverage. Her training in cryptographic analysis allowed her to recognize patterns that others might dismiss as coincidence. The satellite failures weren't random. They were systematic, creating blind spots that would prevent NATO from monitoring specific geographic regions where intelligence indicated unusual activity had been detected. Elena could see that someone with intimate knowledge of alliance surveillance capabilities was deliberately crippling the systems that would detect whatever was being planned. The emergency response protocols required all available personnel to support efforts to restore critical communications, but Elena's security clearance limited her access to the systems that were actually failing. She found herself assigned to monitor diplomatic channels for any indication that foreign governments were aware of NATO's compromised surveillance capabilities, a task that felt inadequate given the scope of the crisis unfolding around her. Blackwood had taken personal command of the restoration effort, establishing himself in the operations center where his authoritative presence could demonstrate leadership to the visiting Pentagon officials. His commands carried the confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. But the technical specialists attempting to diagnose the system failures were reporting information that didn't match his expectations about the nature of the attack. "Sir, the failure patterns don't match known cyberattack methodologies," reported Master Sergeant Angela Rodriguez, the facility's senior communications technician. "We're seeing coordinated interference across multiple frequency ranges, but the techniques being used suggest physical access to our transmission equipment rather than remote penetration of our networks." The assessment troubled Blackwood because it implied security breaches that would reflect poorly on his command oversight. Physical access to NATO communications equipment required insider knowledge and sophisticated planning that suggested threats he hadn't anticipated in his analytical assessments. Rodriguez's technical expertise was unquestionable, but her conclusions challenged his understanding of the facility's vulnerability profile. Dr. Rachel Thompson had been monitoring the crisis from her position in the analytical support section, where senior analysts were attempting to assess the strategic implications of losing surveillance coverage across such critical geographic areas. Her experience with European security issues allowed her to recognize the potential consequences of intelligence gaps that could persist for days or weeks. While technical repairs were completed, Thompson's analysis of the timing patterns confirmed her suspicions that this was not a random attack. The communications failures had begun during a maintenance window, when backup systems would normally be offline for routine updates, suggesting that someone with intimate knowledge of NATO procedures had planned the assault for maximum impact. The sophistication required for such coordination indicated state-level resources and planning capabilities that few organizations possessed. More troubling were the preliminary reports from monitoring stations that remained operational, which indicated unusual military activity in several regions that were now invisible to NATO surveillance. Thompson could see correlation patterns that suggested the communications attack was designed to provide cover for operations that Alliance intelligence would normally detect and assess immediately. Elena had been quietly analyzing the diplomatic traffic flowing through her assigned channels, looking for any indication that foreign governments were aware of NATO's compromised surveillance capabilities. What she discovered was far more alarming than simple awareness. There were subtle indicators suggesting that multiple governments were coordinating responses to intelligence they shouldn't have possessed about NATO's internal operations. Patterns were almost invisible unless someone knew exactly what to look for. But Elena's training in cryptographic analysis allowed her to recognize coded communications, hidden within routine diplomatic exchanges. Foreign intelligence services appeared to be coordinating activities based on detailed knowledge of NATO's surveillance capabilities and current operational blind spots. This suggested not just a cyber attack, but a comprehensive intelligence operation that had penetrated Alliance security at fundamental levels. Elena understood that her observations represented crucial intelligence that could help NATO understand the scope of the security breach. But reporting her findings would require explaining analytical capabilities that exceeded her official qualifications. The coded communications she had identified were embedded so subtly that traditional analysis protocols wouldn't detect them without specifically targeted decryption attempts. Lieutenant Marcus Webb had been assigned to coordinate between different sections of the facility as emergency response teams attempted to restore critical systems. His duties brought him into contact with personnel across the intelligence hub, allowing him to observe how different departments were responding to the crisis. Webb's idealistic notions about military efficiency were being challenged by the confusion and territorial disputes that emerged when normal command structures were disrupted by emergency conditions. The most frustrating aspect of the crisis response was the apparent disconnect between technical specialists who understood the nature of the system's failures and senior officers who were making strategic decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information. Webb watched qualified technicians provide detailed assessments that were then filtered through multiple levels of command before reaching decision-makers who lacked the technical background to understand the implications. Elena Vasquez represented the most extreme example of this dysfunctional information flow. Webb had observed her analyzing diplomatic communications with sophistication that exceeded her official qualifications, identifying patterns that seemed to provide crucial context for understanding the scope of the security breach. But her position in the communications section prevented her from directly briefing senior officers who needed access to her insights. Webb had attempted to bring Elena's observations to the attention of his immediate superiors, But the emergency command structure established by Blackwood prioritized information from certified analysts over input from support personnel. Elena's lack of appropriate security clearances made her insights automatically suspect, regardless of their analytical value or potential importance for understanding the crisis. Captain Diana Foster had been monitoring the international diplomatic response to NATO's communications problems, attempting to assess whether foreign governments were aware of the alliance's compromised surveillance capabilities. Her analysis suggested that several nations were already adjusting their military exercises and diplomatic activities in ways that indicated detailed knowledge of NATO's current intelligence blind spots. Foster's experience with international intelligence coordination allowed her to recognize the signs of sophisticated information warfare campaigns designed to exploit temporary vulnerabilities in alliance surveillance. The speed with which foreign governments were responding to NATO's communications failures suggested advanced knowledge that could only have come from penetration of alliance planning and operational security. The implications were staggering. If foreign intelligence services had achieved the level of penetration suggested by current diplomatic traffic patterns, then NATO's fundamental assumptions about operational security were dangerously compromised. Foster understood that briefing these concerns required access to senior officers who possessed the authority and clearances necessary to coordinate alliance-wide security reviews. Blackwood had established a rigid command hierarchy for managing the crisis response, with all analytical assessments flowing through his personal approval before reaching senior officers or visiting Pentagon officials. This structure was designed to ensure consistency and prevent conflicting information from reaching decision-makers, but it also created bottlenecks that prevented crucial intelligence from reaching people who needed immediate access to emerging threat assessments. Elena found herself in an impossible position as her analysis of diplomatic communications revealed coordination patterns that suggested NATO was facing not just a technical crisis, but a comprehensive intelligence operation designed to exploit alliance vulnerabilities. The coded communications she had identified indicated that foreign intelligence services possessed detailed knowledge of NATO surveillance capabilities, maintenance schedules, and operational procedures that should have been highly classified. Her training told her that these patterns represented an existential threat to alliance security, but reporting her findings would require revealing analytical capabilities that could expose her carefully protected identity. Elena understood that speaking up might save NATO from catastrophic intelligence failures, but it would also destroy everything she had worked to build in her new life. Sergeant David Kim had been watching Elena's reaction to the crisis with growing concern. His experience supervising the communications section had taught him to recognize when his most capable personnel were struggling with information they couldn't officially report. Elena's behavior during the emergency suggested that she was seeing patterns or connections that exceeded her authorized analytical responsibilities. Kim understood that Elena possessed analytical capabilities that went far beyond her official qualifications, though he had never pressed her for details about her background or training. The crisis was revealing the limitations of NATO's rigid security classification system, which prevented qualified personnel from contributing insights that might be crucial for understanding complex intelligence operations. The emergency briefing scheduled for 1800 hours would bring together senior NATO officials, visiting Pentagon representatives, and Colonel Hayes to assess the scope of the communications crisis and develop response strategies. Blackwood viewed this briefing as an opportunity to demonstrate his analytical capabilities under pressure, but Kim worried that critical information might be excluded because it came from unauthorized sources. Dr. Thompson had completed her preliminary analysis of the crisis patterns and reached conclusions that fundamentally challenged Blackwood's assessment of the situation. Her findings suggested that NATO was facing a sophisticated intelligence operation that went far beyond simple cyberattacks or technical sabotage. The coordination required for simultaneous attacks on multiple systems indicated state-level resources and planning capabilities that few organizations possessed. Thompson's analysis had identified correlation patterns between the communications, failures, and unusual diplomatic activity that suggested foreign intelligence services were exploiting NATO's temporary surveillance blind spots to conduct operations that would normally trigger immediate alliance response. The sophistication of this coordination indicated advanced knowledge of NATO procedures and capabilities that represented dangerous security breaches. The challenge was convincing Blackwood to include these assessments in his briefing to senior officials. Thompson's conclusions challenged his initial analysis of the crisis as a manageable technical problem, suggesting instead that NATO faced fundamental compromises to its operational security that required immediate and comprehensive response. From alliance leadership, Elena had continued monitoring diplomatic communications while the facility's technical specialists attempted to restore critical surveillance systems. Her analysis had revealed additional coded communications that provided detailed intelligence about NATO's response procedures and the estimated timeline for restoring full surveillance capabilities. Foreign intelligence services appeared to possess comprehensive knowledge of alliance operations that should have been highly classified. The most alarming discovery was evidence that multiple foreign governments were coordinating military exercises and diplomatic initiatives based on detailed knowledge of NATO's current intelligence blind spots. Elena could see planning patterns that indicated these activities had been prepared in advance, suggesting that the communications attack was part of a larger operation designed to create opportunities for actions that NATO surveillance would normally detect and counter. Elena understood that her analytical findings represented crucial intelligence that could help NATO understand the true scope of the security breach and develop appropriate response strategies. But sharing this information would require explaining how she had identified coded communications that traditional analysis protocols couldn't detect without specialized cryptographic training. The decision between personal safety and professional responsibility was becoming impossible to avoid. Elena's expertise had revealed threats that could fundamentally compromise NATO's security, but speaking up would expose everything she had worked to protect about her new identity and carefully constructed life. Blackwood had scheduled the emergency briefing to demonstrate his analytical capabilities to Colonel Hayes and the Pentagon representatives, but the information he planned to present focused primarily on technical aspects of the communications failures rather than the broader intelligence implications that Thompson and others had identified. His confidence in his own assessment was absolute, but it was based on incomplete analysis that missed crucial patterns visible to more experienced intelligence professionals. The briefing would determine NATO's initial response to what appeared to be the most serious intelligence crisis the alliance had faced in decades. Elena understood that the information she had discovered could fundamentally change how senior officials understood the nature of the threat, but revealing her insights would require exposing capabilities that could destroy everything she had built in her carefully protected new life. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force Elena to choose between continued invisibility and the knowledge that NATO's security might depend on information that only she could provide. The woman dismissed as a translator was about to face the most difficult decision of her carefully reconstructed life. The emergency briefing room fell silent as Colonel Patricia Hayes studied the classified documents that had been rushed to her from Washington during the communications crisis. Her gray eyes, hardened by 30 years of military intelligence operations, scanned technical reports and analytical assessments that painted a picture far more complex than anyone at NATO headquarters had realized. The leather portfolio she carried contained presidential authorization for actions that could fundamentally alter the alliance's approach to internal security. Hayes had arrived in Brussels with a specific mission that went beyond routine inspection of NATO's intelligence coordination procedures. American intelligence agencies had been tracking a sophisticated penetration operation targeting alliance communications infrastructure for over 18 months, following digital breadcrumbs that led through multiple foreign intelligence services to a conspiracy that threatened the foundation of Western military cooperation. Major Richard Blackwood stood at the head of the conference table, his presentation materials arranged with characteristic precision as he prepared to brief the assembled senior officers on his assessment of the communications crisis. His confidence remained absolute despite the scope of the emergency, and he viewed the briefing as an opportunity to demonstrate analytical capabilities that would impress Pentagon officials and advance his career prospects. The audience included representatives from 12 NATO member nations, each carrying security clearances that granted access to intelligence, so sensitive that its existence was known only to a handful of officials in each country. Hayes understood that the information she was about to reveal would fundamentally change how these officers understood the nature of the threats facing the alliance. Elena Vasquez sat in the back corner of the briefing room, her presence barely acknowledged by senior officers who viewed support personnel as essentially invisible during high-level discussions. Her official role was to provide translation support if needed, but she carried with her analysis of coded communications that revealed the true scope of the intelligence operation targeting NATO's surveillance capabilities. The weight of her discoveries pressed against her consciousness like a physical burden. Elena understood that the information she had uncovered could prevent catastrophic intelligence failures, but revealing her findings would expose analytical capabilities that could destroy the carefully constructed identity she had maintained for 3 years. The choice between personal safety and alliance security had become impossible to avoid. Blackwood began his presentation with characteristic authority, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention from senior military officials. His slides displayed technical assessments of the communications failures, focusing on immediate restoration procedures and defensive measures designed to prevent similar attacks in the future. The coordinated attack on our surveillance infrastructure represents a sophisticated but manageable challenge to NATO operations, Blackwood announced, his tone suggesting complete mastery of complex technical and strategic issues. Our preliminary analysis indicates cyberattack methodologies consistent with known foreign intelligence capabilities, but nothing that suggests penetration of our most sensitive systems. Hayes listened to Blackwood's assessment with growing concern, recognizing the fundamental gaps in his understanding of the crisis. Her classified briefing materials contained intelligence that painted a far more alarming picture of the threats facing NATO, evidence of systematic penetration that went far beyond simple cyberattacks or technical sabotage. Dr. Rachel Thompson had been excluded from the formal briefing roster due to security protocol restrictions, but her preliminary analysis of the crisis patterns contradicted virtually every conclusion in Blackwood's presentation. Thompson understood that senior officials were receiving dangerously incomplete information about threats that could compromise alliance security for years to come. The most troubling aspect of Blackwood's presentation was his dismissal of intelligence. That suggested coordinated foreign government responses to NATO's compromised surveillance capabilities. Thompson had identified diplomatic traffic patterns that indicated multiple nations were exploiting alliance intelligence blind spots, but Blackwood had excluded these findings from his formal assessment as unverified speculation. Elena's analysis of coded communications had revealed coordination patterns that went far beyond anything Thompson had identified through traditional analytical methods. The cryptographic techniques embedded in routine diplomatic exchanges indicated planning and resource allocation that suggested state-level intelligence operations with comprehensive knowledge of NATO procedures and capabilities. Lieutenant Marcus Webb watched the briefing with growing frustration as he observed senior officers making strategic decisions based on information that excluded crucial insights from the facility's most capable analytical personnel. Webb understood that NATO's rigid security classification system was preventing qualified analysts from contributing intelligence that might be essential for understanding the true scope of the crisis. Hayes had remained silent during Blackwood's presentation, allowing him to complete his assessment before introducing information that would fundamentally challenge his conclusions. Her experience with intelligence operations had taught her to recognize the difference between confident presentation and analytical accuracy, and Blackwood's briefing displayed troubling gaps in understanding that suggested dangerous miscalculation of the threats facing the alliance. Captain Diana Foster had been monitoring international diplomatic responses to NATO's communications crisis from her position in the Interagency Coordination Section. Her findings painted a picture of foreign government activity that indicated detailed advanced knowledge of alliance surveillance capabilities and operational procedures, evidence that suggested security breaches far more serious than Blackwood had acknowledged. Foster's analysis had identified correlation patterns between the communications, attacks and diplomatic initiatives that appeared designed to exploit NATO's temporary intelligence blind spots. The sophistication of this coordination indicated planning that must have begun months before the actual attacks, suggesting systematic penetration of alliance security that represented existential threats to NATO's operational effectiveness. Hayes finally stood to address the assembled officers, her movement commanding immediate attention from everyone in the briefing room. The weight of her authority was unmistakable, and senior officers who had been discussing technical restoration procedures fell silent as they recognized that she carried information that would fundamentally change their understanding of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, her voice carrying the gravity of someone delivering information that would alter strategic calculations throughout the alliance. "The communications crisis you've been managing represents only the visible component of an intelligence operation that has been targeting NATO infrastructure for over 18 months. The revelation sent shockwaves through the briefing room, as senior officers realized that their understanding of the crisis had been dangerously incomplete. Blackwood's confident presentation suddenly seemed naive and inadequate, his technical assessments missing crucial context that suggested threats far more serious than simple cyberattacks or system failures. Hayes continued her briefing with methodical precision, describing intelligence operations that had achieved systematic penetration of NATO communications, surveillance procedures, and operational planning. American intelligence agencies had been tracking digital signatures and communication patterns that revealed coordination between multiple foreign intelligence services and operations, designed to compromise alliance security at fundamental levels. The individual responsible for orchestrating this penetration operation was Colonel Marcus Steele, formerly of the National Security Agency, Hayes announced, her words hitting Elena like physical blows. Steele had been selling classified intelligence to foreign governments for over 5 years before his network was finally exposed through counterintelligence operations that began 3 years ago. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as Hayes described the investigation that had finally revealed the true scope of Steele's betrayal. The man who had destroyed her career and reputation had continued his treasonous activities for years after her exile, selling NATO intelligence and American cryptographic capabilities to hostile governments that used the information to plan operations against alliance interests. Hayes pulled a classified document from her briefing folder, its red cover indicating intelligence so sensitive that most NATO officials had never seen materials with equivalent security markings. Steele's confession, obtained shortly before his death in federal custody 18 months ago, revealed the systematic frame operation that destroyed the career of Dr. Elena Rodriguez, one of the most gifted cryptographic analysts in American intelligence history. The mention of Elena's real name created a ripple of confusion through the briefing room as officers attempted to understand the connection between historical intelligence failures and their current crisis. Blackwood's expression shifted from confidence to bewilderment as he realized that Hayes was describing events that fundamentally challenged his understanding of the personnel under his command. Hayes continued reading from Steele's confession, describing how Elena had been systematically framed for security breaches that were actually the result of his own treasonous activities. The fabricated evidence, false testimony, and bureaucratic manipulation that had destroyed Elena's career were documented in devastating detail, revealing a conspiracy that had allowed Steele to continue selling American secrets, while one of the country's most capable analysts was driven into exile. Dr. Rodriguez was guilty of nothing except discovering evidence of Steele's betrayal and attempting to report it through proper channels, Hayes announced, her voice carrying the weight of institutional guilt over injustices that had taken years to acknowledge. She was sacrificed to protect a conspiracy that continued compromising American and NATO security for years after her disgrace. Elena sat frozen in her chair as 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity dissolved around her. Every officer in the room was now staring at the woman they had dismissed as a translator, realizing that their assumptions about her background and capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. Blackwood's face had gone pale as he understood the implications of his treatment of someone whose expertise exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. Hayes reached into her briefing folder and withdrew a second document, this one bearing presidential seals and authorization signatures that indicated the highest levels of American government approval. I carry orders for the complete restoration of Dr. Rodriguez's security clearances, promotion to senior executive service with equivalent military rank of colonel, and appointment as NATO's new director of cryptographic analysis. The offer represented everything Elena had lost 3 years ago and more. Complete vindication accompanied by advancement that would place her among the most senior intelligence officials in the alliance. Hayes was offering not just restoration, but elevation to positions of authority that would allow her to reshape NATO's approach to cryptographic security and intelligence analysis. Elena stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room as she faced a choice that would determine not just her own future, but potentially the security of the entire Western alliance. The woman who had been dismissed as a translator now held the power to accept recognition that would validate everything she had sacrificed, or to choose a different path that might serve larger purposes than personal vindication. Colonel Hayes, Elena began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I appreciate the gesture more than you can possibly understand. The knowledge that the truth has finally been revealed means everything to me. Hayes waited for Elena's response, understanding that the offer she had made represented institutional acknowledgement of injustices that had taken far too long to address. The room remained silent as senior officers processed the complete inversion of their assumptions about the woman they had worked alongside for years without recognizing her true capabilities. Elena's analysis of decoded communications during the current crisis had revealed intelligence that could fundamentally change NATO's understanding of the threats facing the alliance, but sharing that information would require revealing analytical capabilities that went far beyond translation support. The choice between continued anonymity and alliance security had been made impossible to avoid by Hayes's revelations. Blackwood stood frozen at the head of the conference table, his presentation materials suddenly seeming pathetically inadequate. As he realized that his dismissive treatment of Elena had been based on catastrophic misunderstanding of her background and capabilities. The woman he had excluded from analytical discussions possessed expertise that exceeded his own in virtually every area relevant to the current crisis. Dr. Thompson felt a mixture of vindication and concern, as her suspicions about Elena's background were confirmed in the most dramatic way possible. The gaps in Elena's official personnel file now made perfect sense, but Thompson understood that revelation of Elena's true identity would fundamentally change the dynamics of intelligence operations. Throughout the NATO facility, Elena reached into her document folder and withdrew the analysis she had completed of coded communications discovered during the crisis. Intelligence that revealed coordination patterns suggesting systematic exploitation of NATO's compromised surveillance capabilities by multiple foreign governments. Her findings painted a picture of threats that went far beyond anything Blackwood had acknowledged in his presentation. The communications attack represents only the initial phase of a comprehensive operation designed to create intelligence blind spots that multiple foreign governments are already exploiting, Elena announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose expertise was finally being recognized. I've identified coded coordination between at least 6 different intelligence services, indicating planning and resource allocation for operations that NATO surveillance would normally detect and counter. Hayes studied Elena's analysis with the intensity of someone recognizing intelligence that could fundamentally alter strategic calculations throughout the alliance. The patterns Elena had identified using cryptographic techniques that few analysts possessed revealed threats that justified immediate and comprehensive response from NATO leadership. The briefing room erupted in urgent discussions as senior officers realized that their understanding of the crisis had been dangerously incomplete. Elena's analysis provided context that explained diplomatic activities and military exercises that had seemed routine, but were actually coordinated responses to detailed knowledge of NATO's current intelligence capabilities and operational blind spots. Blackwood's presentation had focused on technical restoration procedures, but Elena's findings suggested that NATO faced systematic compromise of its most sensitive operations. The alliance's fundamental assumptions about operational security were apparently based on illusions that hostile intelligence services had been exploiting for months or years. Elena continued her briefing with methodical precision, describing cryptographic techniques that had been embedded in routine diplomatic communications to coordinate activities that exploited NATO's temporary surveillance blind spots. The sophistication of these operations indicated state-level resources and planning capabilities that represented existential threats to alliance security. Hayes understood that Elena's analysis provided crucial intelligence for developing response strategies that could address the true scope of the security breaches facing NATO. The woman who had been dismissed as a translator had uncovered threats that traditional analytical methods had failed to detect, demonstrating capabilities that made her indispensable for addressing the crisis. The revelation of Elena's true identity and expertise had fundamentally changed the dynamics in the briefing room, but it had also exposed her to scrutiny that could complicate her carefully protected new life. Elena faced choices that would determine not just her own future, NATO's ability to address threats that could compromise alliance security for years to come. Elena Rodriguez stood in the emergency briefing room, surrounded by the stunned faces of NATO's most senior intelligence officials, holding documents that could reshape the Western Alliance's approach to cryptographic security while simultaneously determining the trajectory of her own carefully reconstructed life. The weight of Colonel Hayes's offer pressed against her consciousness like a physical force, complete restoration accompanied by advancement that would elevate her to positions of authority she had never imagined possible. The silence stretched across the underground facility as Elena considered choices that would determine not just her personal future, but potentially the security of 47 allied nations. 3 years of exile had taught her lessons about identity, purpose, and the difference between vindication and peace that couldn't be learned through any amount of professional success or institutional recognition. Major Richard Blackwood remained frozen at the head of the conference table, his presentation materials scattered across surfaces that now seemed to mock his earlier confidence. The revelation of Elena's true background had exposed every dismissive comment and condescending gesture as symptoms of intellectual arrogance that had nearly prevented NATO from recognizing existential threats to alliance security. His career was effectively over. The Pentagon officials witnessing his humiliation would carry reports back to Washington that would end any possibility of advancement or choice assignments. Blackwood understood that his treatment of the woman he had dismissed as a translator would become a cautionary tale told in leadership seminars throughout the American military establishment. Elena looked directly at Hayes, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that comes from understanding what truly matters in the grand scheme of human endeavor. "Colonel, your offer represents justice that I've dreamed about for 3 years. The knowledge that my innocence has been proven and my reputation restored means more than you can possibly understand." Hayes waited for Elena's complete response, recognizing the weight of institutional guilt that had driven American intelligence leadership to authorize unprecedented restoration of rank and responsibility. The injustices Elena had endured represented systematic failures that had taken far too long to acknowledge and address. "But I've learned something during my time in exile that I couldn't have understood while I was consumed with proving my worth to institutions that had already decided my fate," Elena continued, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had discovered identity beyond professional recognition. "Competence doesn't require validation from people who measure worth through security clearances and organizational charts." The response sent ripples of surprise through the assembled officers who had expected Elena to embrace opportunities for advancement that would restore everything she had lost. Dr. Rachel Thompson watched with professional fascination as Elena navigated choices that challenged conventional assumptions about ambition and career success. Elena reached into her briefing folder and withdrew additional analysis she had completed during the communications crisis. Intelligence products that revealed the true scope of foreign penetration of NATO's most sensitive operations. Her cryptographic techniques had uncovered coordination patterns that traditional analytical methods couldn't detect, evidence of systematic exploitation that threatened the foundation of alliance security. "The coded communications I've identified indicate that foreign intelligence services possess detailed knowledge of NATO surveillance capabilities, maintenance schedules, and operational procedures that should be classified at the highest levels," Elena announced, her presentation displaying analytical sophistication that exceeded anything Blackwood had produced. "This suggests penetration that goes far beyond the communications attack we've been addressing." Hayes studied Elena's findings with growing alarm, recognizing intelligence that justified immediate and comprehensive response from the highest levels of American and NATO leadership. The patterns Elena had identified revealed threats that could compromise alliance operations for years unless addressed through systematic security reviews and fundamental changes to intelligence sharing protocols. Elena's analysis had uncovered evidence that multiple foreign governments were coordinating military exercises and diplomatic initiatives based on detailed advance knowledge of NATO's intelligence blind spots. The sophistication of this coordination indicated planning that must have involved systematic collection of classified information over extended periods, suggesting security breaches that represented existential threats to alliance effectiveness. Lieutenant Marcus Webb watched the proceedings with admiration for Elena's analytical capabilities and growing understanding of how NATO's rigid, hierarchical structures had prevented crucial intelligence from reaching decision-makers who needed immediate access to emerging threat assessments. Elena's expertise had been available to the alliance for 3 years, but institutional prejudices had prevented recognition of capabilities that could have identified these threats much earlier. Sergeant David Kim felt a mixture of pride and regret as he observed Elena's transformation from dismissed translator to recognized expert whose insights were fundamentally changing NATO's understanding of the crisis. Kim had supervised Elena for 2 years without realizing that her background included capabilities that exceeded those of the facility's most senior analysts. Captain Diana Foster had been monitoring international diplomatic responses to the crisis from her interagency coordination position, and Elena's findings provided context that explained activities she had observed but couldn't fully interpret. Foreign governments had been adjusting their diplomatic and military postures based on detailed knowledge of NATO's operational procedures, evidence of intelligence penetration that Foster now understood represented systematic compromise of alliance security. Elena continued her briefing with methodical precision, describing cryptographic evidence that revealed coordination between foreign intelligence services in operations designed to exploit NATO's compromised surveillance capabilities. Her analysis provided roadmaps for understanding how hostile governments had been collecting and sharing intelligence about alliance operations, information that could guide comprehensive security reviews and defensive measures. The communications attack was designed to create temporary blind spots that would prevent NATO from detecting coordinated activities that multiple foreign governments had been planning for months. Elena explained, her presentation revealing analytical depth that impressed even the most experienced intelligence professionals in the room. I've identified at least 17 different diplomatic and military initiatives that were coordinated to exploit our compromised surveillance capabilities. Hayes understood that Elena's intelligence products represented the most significant counterintelligence breakthrough NATO had achieved in decades, providing insights that could fundamentally alter the alliance's approach to operational security and intelligence sharing. Elena's expertise had uncovered threats that traditional analytical methods had failed to detect, demonstrating capabilities that made her indispensable for addressing the crisis. But Elena's next statement surprised everyone in the briefing room, including Hayes, who had expected immediate acceptance of opportunities that would restore Elena's position in the intelligence community, while advancing her to unprecedented levels of authority and responsibility. I'm going to decline your generous offer of restoration and advancement, Elena announced, her decision sending shock waves through assembled officers, who couldn't understand why anyone would reject such unprecedented opportunities for professional vindication and career advancement. 3 years of exile have taught me that my worth isn't determined by institutional recognition or security clearances. The response challenged fundamental assumptions about ambition and success that had guided the careers of everyone in the briefing room. Hayes struggled to understand how Elena could reject opportunities that represented complete vindication accompanied by advancement that would place her among the most senior intelligence officials in the Western Alliance. Elena's explanation revealed wisdom that couldn't be acquired through professional advancement or institutional recognition, insights about identity and purpose that had emerged from years of surviving in positions beneath her actual capabilities. I've learned to measure success differently than I did when my identity was defined by security clearances and organizational authority. She gestured toward the analysis she had provided, intelligence products that had been developed while working in positions that most intelligence professionals would consider beneath their dignity. The most important work I've done in the past 3 years happened while I was dismissed as a translator, using capabilities that institutional prejudices prevented others from recognizing. Elena's decision reflected understanding that transcended conventional measures of career success, recognition that competence and contribution mattered more than titles or advancement opportunities. Her expertise had identified threats that could compromise NATO security, regardless of whether she held senior positions or worked in support roles that others might consider inadequate. The intelligence I've provided will help NATO address systematic security breaches that represent existential threats to alliance operations. Elena continued, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who understood her own worth independent of institutional validation. That contribution matters more than any restoration of rank or advancement opportunity you could offer. Hayes made one final attempt to convince Elena to accept opportunities that American intelligence leadership had authorized, to address injustices that had taken far too long to acknowledge. Dr. Rodriguez, your expertise is irreplaceable for addressing the threats you've identified. NATO needs your capabilities and positions of authority that would allow you to reshape alliance security procedures. Elena's smile reflected peace that couldn't be acquired through professional advancement or institutional recognition, wisdom that had emerged from years of finding purpose in work that others had dismissed as beneath her capabilities. Colonel, I appreciate your concern, but I've found something more valuable than career advancement or institutional authority. She explained her decision with clarity that surprised even herself, articulating insights about identity and contribution that had crystallized during her years of exile from positions that had once defined her entire sense of self-worth. I've learned that expertise can be more effective when it operates outside institutional hierarchies that limit recognition based on credentials rather than competence. Elena's analysis of the current crisis had been developed while working in positions that traditional intelligence structures would consider inadequate for someone with her background and capabilities. But those same positions had provided access to information and analytical opportunities that senior officials might have missed due to their focus on classified intelligence and formal analytical procedures. I'm going to establish an independent consulting organization that specializes in cryptographic analysis for clients who need expertise that operates outside traditional institutional constraints, Elena announced, describing plans that would allow her to contribute capabilities while maintaining independence from organizational hierarchies that had once defined her professional identity. The concept challenged conventional assumptions about how intelligence expertise should be organized and utilized, suggesting that valuable analytical capabilities might be more effective when freed from institutional prejudices and hierarchical limitations. Elena's experience had demonstrated that competence could be hidden by organizational structures that measured worth through credentials rather than actual contribution. Hayes understood that Elena's decision represented loss of capabilities that NATO desperately needed for addressing threats that traditional analytical methods had failed to detect. But she also recognized wisdom in Elena's choice that reflected understanding of identity and purpose that transcended conventional measures of professional success. Elena's consulting organization would specialize in analytical challenges that required expertise in cryptographic techniques and pattern recognition that few intelligence professionals possessed. Her independence from institutional hierarchies would allow her to work with clients who needed capabilities that traditional organizations might not recognize or value appropriately. The model Elena described would allow her to contribute expertise while maintaining control over how her capabilities were utilized and recognized. Her experience with institutional betrayal had taught her valuable lessons about the importance of independence and the dangers of trusting organizations that measured worth through political considerations rather than actual competence. Major Blackwood's humiliation was complete as he watched Elena reject opportunities that represented everything he had spent his career pursuing, advancement and authority that would have validated his assumptions about professional success and institutional recognition. Elena's choice revealed the hollowness of ambitions that prioritized credentials over actual contribution to meaningful purposes. Elena gathered her analytical materials and prepared to leave the briefing room that had witnessed her transformation from dismissed translator to recognized expert whose insights were fundamentally changing NATO's understanding of alliance security threats. Her decision to decline restoration opportunities would become legendary throughout the intelligence community, inspiring discussions about the true meaning of professional success and personal worth. Dr. Thompson approached Elena as the briefing concluded, her expression reflecting admiration for choices that challenged conventional assumptions about career advancement and professional recognition. Elena, your decision takes more courage than most people could manage. What you've accomplished while working in positions others would consider beneath Their dignity demonstrates something important about competence and contribution. Elena's response reflected wisdom that had emerged from years of finding purpose, independent of institutional validation or professional recognition. Dr. Thompson, I've learned that the most important work often happens in places where others don't think to look. Competence doesn't require credentials to be effective. Lieutenant Webb had observed Elena's transformation with growing understanding of how organizational hierarchies could prevent recognition of valuable capabilities that didn't fit conventional expectations about expertise and authority. Elena's experience demonstrated the importance of recognizing competence, regardless of its source or the credentials accompanying it. The aftermath of Elena's revelation and subsequent decision would reshape NATO's approach to personnel evaluation and intelligence analysis, inspiring systematic reviews of how the alliance identified and utilized analytical capabilities that might be hidden by institutional prejudices or hierarchical limitations. Elena's consulting organization attracted clients from across the intelligence community who recognized that her independence from institutional constraints allowed her to provide analytical capabilities that traditional organizations might not offer. Her expertise in cryptographic analysis and pattern recognition proved invaluable for addressing challenges that required thinking outside conventional analytical frameworks. The NATO facility implemented new procedures for recognizing and utilizing expertise that might not be reflected in traditional credentials or security clearances, inspired by Elena's demonstration that valuable capabilities could be hidden by organizational assumptions about worth and competence. Major Blackwood's career ended with transfer to administrative positions that reflected the consequences of leadership failures that had nearly prevented NATO from recognizing existential threats to alliance security. His treatment of Elena became a cautionary tale used in leadership training throughout the military establishment. Colonel Hayes returned to Washington carrying reports about intelligence procedures that required fundamental reform to prevent future failures in recognizing and utilizing analytical capabilities that didn't fit conventional organizational expectations. Elena's case inspired systematic reviews of personnel evaluation procedures throughout the American intelligence community. Elena established her consulting practice in a renovated building outside Brussels, creating workspace that reflected her commitment to analytical excellence without the institutional constraints that had once limited her effectiveness. Her independence allowed her to pursue investigation methods and analytical approaches that traditional organizations might not authorize or recognize. The consulting organization attracted analytical challenges that required expertise in cryptographic techniques and pattern recognition that few professionals possessed, allowing Elena to contribute capabilities while maintaining control over how her expertise was utilized and recognized. Elena's decision to decline restoration opportunities inspired discussions throughout the intelligence community about the relationship between professional recognition and personal worth, challenging assumptions about career advancement and institutional authority that had guided generations of intelligence professionals. Her analytical products continued to influence NATO security procedures and intelligence sharing protocols, demonstrating that valuable contributions could emerge from sources that operated outside traditional organizational hierarchies and credential requirements. The woman who had been dismissed as a translator had demonstrated that competence transcended institutional recognition, that expertise could be more effective when freed from organizational constraints that limited recognition, based on credentials rather than actual contribution to meaningful purposes. Elena Rodriguez had found something more valuable than vindication or advancement opportunities, discovering purpose and identity that couldn't be granted by institutions or taken away by organizational betrayal. Her choice to forge an independent path inspired others to consider whether true professional success might be measured differently than conventional metrics suggested. The intelligence community would remember Elena's story is demonstration that the most important qualities couldn't be destroyed by institutional injustice or granted through organizational advancement, that competence and character represented forms of wealth that belong to individuals regardless of external recognition or professional circumstances. Elena's legacy would extend far beyond her analytical contributions to NATO security, inspiring future generations of intelligence professionals to understand that their worth transcended institutional validation and that the most meaningful work often emerged from choosing purpose over prestige, contribution over credentials, and wisdom over revenge. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.